Welcome, everybody. Today I am going to be reading some Hegel. Yeah, can you see that? Yeah, perfect. Just make sure that I can see this properly on my screen here. And then we shall read primarily the English, but it's good to have the German beside us. It is natural to assume that in philosophy, before one gets down to dealing with what really matters, namely the actual cognition of what there is in truth, it would be first necessary to reach prior agreement about cognition, namely about whether it is to be viewed either as the instrument with which one takes possession of the absolute, or as the means by which one catches a glimpse of it. There is a certain unease about this which seems in part justified because there are various kinds of cognition, and it would well be that one of them, rather than another, would be better suited to achieving this final end, and that a wrong choice among them is thereby possible. In part, this unease is justified because cognition is a faculty of determinate kind and extent, and without a more precise determination of its nature and limits, we might end up grasping vaporous clouds of error instead of entering into the heaven of truth. This unease is even bound to be transformed into the conviction both that the entire project of acquiring what is in itself for consciousness by way of cognition is in its very concept absurd, and that there is a sharp line separating cognition from the absolute. This is so because if we suppose cognition to be the instrument by means of which we take hold of absolute essence, then it is obvious that if we apply an instrument to something, the application does not in fact leave it be as it is on its own. Rather, it sets out to reshape it and change it. Or if cognition is not an instrument of our activity, but is to some extent a passive medium through which light of truth reaches us, then here too we do not receive the truth as it is in itself, but only as it comes through this medium and in the medium. In both cases, we employ a means which immediately engenders the very opposite of its intended purpose. That is, the very absurdity of the enterprise lies in our making use of many means at all. To be sure, it seems that this evil stands to be remedied by means of a cognition of the way the instrument works, for such a cognition would make it possible to peel away the representation, the part of the absolute which we receive by virtue of the instrument, from that part which belongs to the instrument, and thus we would receive the truth in its purity. However, this improvement would in fact merely bring us back to where we were before. If once again subtract from the reshaped thing that the instrument has added to it, then the thing here, the absolute, is once again for us exactly as it was prior to this fully superfluous effort. However, much we were just supposed to bring the absolute a bit closer to us by means of the instrument, and not have the instrument change anything in it at all, perhaps similar to the way we would ensnare a bird on a twig covered in birdlime. The absolute itself would nonetheless almost surely cast scorn on this ruse if it were both in and for itself already there with us and wanted to be there. In that case, cognition itself would merely be a ruse, since all its efforts would only amount to its putting on airs about doing something which is quite different from engendering a merely immediate or thereby trouble-free relation. Or if in the examination and testing of cognition which we represent as a medium, we learn about the law of its refraction, then it is also equally useless to subtract this refraction from the result, for it is not the refraction of the ray, but rather the ray itself by way of which the truth comes into contact with us. And this is subtracted, then all it would point to is either a pure direction or an empty location. So let's see what Pinkard has to say about this in another book. I'm just looking through Pinkard. Okay. So we're on, in this aphorism here, we're on aphorism 73. So what does Pinkard have to say about aphorism 73? The preface was written after Hegel completed the phenomenology, after already completed his voyage of discovery. The introduction was written as he was beginning the phenomenology, when he still thought of the book as part one, the science of the experience of consciousness. We are at the beginning of the voyage, and we've got an idea of what we will discover. Do note again that experience is, in this sense, is erfahrung, as in the phrase learn from experience, not in the sense of what is immediately undergone in the privacy of one's own heart. The voyage begins, and even the author does not yet know it will end in a phenomenology of spirit rather than just a science of the experience of consciousness. 73. It comes easily to us to think that in philosophy we first have to ask for something like a criterion of knowledge that we can apply to various statements. If we had such a criterion, we could then know in advance whether something was even a candidate for being shown. This stems from a kind of classical version of skepticism. How can I know that my representation of reality corresponds to reality itself? However, behind that, the more general question at first seems to be, what is the line between thought and what thought is about? How is it drawn? Who or what draws it? Hegel wants to suggest, a little ironically, that the proper way to put it is, suppose that what we want to know, if, and especially the absolute or the unconditioned, is cut off from us, that we can know it, that we cannot know it. Or suppose that the absolute cooperates with us, as in some of our own current talk about the world making something true or cooperating with us. Perhaps knowledge, erkenntnis, cognition, is an instrument. Perhaps instrument changes, or that the medium distorts what we, so that we end up with the thing in itself. If we do, what are we left with? Nothing. In any event, to draw a line between thought and the world is to stand on both sides of the line. That is, of course, reminiscent of Wittgenstein's preface to his Tractatus. To set a limit of thought, we should have to find both sides of the limit thinkable. We should have to be able to think what cannot be thought. For the curious, there is no reason at all to think that Wittgenstein got any of that from Hegel. Right, let's see if Stephen Hoolgate has anything to say on the introduction. I don't think he does. No, I don't think he does. As far as I know. So, in Hoolgate's Guide to the Phenomenology, he leaves out he does have an introduction, the context, and then he has the overview of themes, and then reading the text. But there isn't an analysis of the introduction. So what we're going to do is we're going to read Harris. No, that's Harris's book on Giovanni Gentile. And what we're looking for is Hegel's Ladder. Okay, I found it here. So we are on aphorism 74. Okay, here we go. Hegel's introduction. I mean, Harris is just unbelievable. Part 3, Chapter 3. Only after the preface was written and printed did Hegel come to a final decision about the title of his introductory science. Initially, the book was printed with the part title, Part 1, Science of the Experience of Consciousness, between the preface and the introduction. A new part title, 1, Science of the Phenomenology of Spirit, was issued together with a list of printing errors for the volume. But the main title page always carried the subtitle, First Part, The Phenomenology of Spirit. The printing of the book began in February 1806, and Hegel used the available sheets as a textbook for his lectures in the summer of that year. The lecture announcement for the course on speculative philosophy or logic speaks simply of a system of science soon to appear. The subtitle Phenomenologia Mentis appears in the announcement for the winter 1806-07. The winter, of course, which Hegel probably did not give, the winter course, which Hegel probably did not give, was now called Logic and Metaphysics or Speculative Philosophy. It's lovely. My phone seems to be following all the time these days. Is a prelude to logic proper. The text is now designated as the soon to appear first part of his book, Science, System of Science. He probably intended to give a rapid overview of the phenomenology, which was there to be read, and devote most of his lectures to the properly speculative logic, for which was only an introduction. This is just the opposite of what he had done in the summer. Then he had expounded the science of experience fully and summarized the speculative logic in whatever time was left. But Hegel typically adopted his class procedures to serve the needs of his ongoing research. Science of the Experience of Consciousness was the book's logical title. Introduction is designated to explicate this title. There was no compelling reason why Hegel could not have retained the title of Science, even after he had decided to call the book itself by the material subject name, Phenomenology of Spirit. It looks as if he decided not to do that when he set himself to write the publisher's announcement for the book. He must have been influenced by the thought that readers would have confused by the two different titles. But it is also clear that he came to feel that the confusion was not worth courting or risking, because the logical character of the book did not deserve quite so much emphasis. This is evident from the lecture announcement for the winter term, and is confirmed by the contrast between preface and the publisher's announcement. The preface itself seems to be designed to lead us naturally from the book's title page in parts 17 to 37 to the part title. But in the announcement, the book is characterized exclusively in terms of shapes of stations of the way into itself, through which it becomes pure knowing absolute spirit. The 3 pre-spiritual chapters on consciousness are lumped together in the announcements as one main division. The existence of subdivisions referred to, but chapter 4 itself is treated in the Anzeige as a judgment. Okay, so yes. So let's read down here and just get to the introduction. This was written early and printed, so let's see what it says. This is the concept that must now itself set forth as science, and therefore it is just as impossible to evade the substantial religious dimension of the phenomenology as it is to evade the complete resolution of the religious dimension into human subjectivity. The destiny of that stably substantial world of conscious experience is to carry the resurrected identity of God and man and the spirit. This was written early and printed first. Hegel gave no heading at that stage, did not need one until the preface was added, after the whole manuscript was completed and delivered to the printer. It was first designated as the Einleitung in the table of contents. It begins with a brief dialectical attack on critical doubts and then provides a short account of the evolution of consciousness into science. The principal topic, however, is the method involved in this build-up and in our scientific exposition of it. This part of the text has been studied and expounded more often than every part of Hegel's text. So the dialectic of doubt, B. Before we attempt the cognition of what truly is, it seems reasonable to ask whether this is possible. Perhaps there is a special mode of cognition for it, but skepticism about it seems more reasonable because of our cognition is an instrument. It must affect what it is used on, which is therefore not absolute. And if cognition is a passive medium, then what we know is what is qua knowledge, qua knowable. Can we knowingly undo this qualification of what is? Then it is unknown again. Can we regard cognition as drawing near to the absolute? Then it could escape unless it is necessarily with us already. And if the medium refracts it, then the correction would give just a straight ray of activity or blank space for the object. As the approach to absolute beginning, the simple immediacy of the experience of consciousness, Hegel's introduction is a dialectical in Aristotelian sense. We begin with a rapid survey of views of the many and the wise, and out of the comparison we derive by introspection the sort of reflective observation that we employ throughout a concept of the experience of consciousness, which validates itself empirically by comprehending both what the many take for granted unreflectively and what the wise have concluded by reflective observation. The views taken under our observation are diametrically opposed to one another. The wise are observed as their most skeptical extreme, and the many at the extreme and naive confidence. But since the two extremes are both explained by our concept, and both are present in our actual beginning, when we come to it, the fact that both parties actually exhibit a continuum of views that runs from one extreme to the other is neutralized. The fact that we do have the capacity for rational introspection, and that we can use this capacity in a critical way, is taken for granted from the first as the common ground shared by the many and the wise, even in their most radical opposition. That we are spontaneously and intuitively speculative self-observers is, as we shall discover in the mind, the philosophical sense in which the absolute is and wills to be shown by uns in itself. The religious presence of the absolute is a dialectical one, for among the many and among the wise, there will always be doubters and agnostics. We shall possess the Vorstellung of God as spirit, and we know the story of how he has appeared. But we have a variety of attitude towards that story and its phases, and many of those recognized as most enlightened, whether they are deists or materialists, regard it as no better than a fairy tale. But the variety of attitudes is possible and necessary only because of the capacity for the free subject reflection that is always beyond the Sache selbst, that reason can be used and that its free use must be respected is the unrecognized presence of the absolute by uns, at home with us in our own house. And in this case, the dialectic of doubt, which remains possible, operates in favor of the actual presence that is claimed. Anyone who denies that, the free self-critical and the self-observing capacity of thought must be respected as an absolute, can do so only in the pre-critical confidence of religious faith. It is only when God is with us in one way, the way of the many, that he can be absent from us in another, the way of the wise. With some of us, of course, he is present in both. The science of experience will make that universally the case. The Aristotelian dialectic begins, as it must, on the side of the wise. For it is only after the birth of critical doubt that the need for a dialectical approach of what is primitively known for certain can be perceived. The need for speculative critique of reason, which the phenomenology plainly is, cannot arise until someone claims that we do not have the speculative knowledge at all. Only then does it become a natural idea, a Vorstellung, that we need to study for our own faculty of cognition before we start making knowledge claims. The problem of skepticism can, of course, arise without any division between ordinary certainty and wisdom. The suggestion that there are different kinds of cognition is a commonsensical one, that someone is not religious and remains blind to the truth of the faith, for this reason belongs to the dialectic of ordinary consciousness. But it is not in this ordinary sense that Hegel raises this possibility first. He is concerned rather with that party among the learned which boasts of its immediate rationality and divinity. It can be thought that the cognition of what truly is the function of an immediate insight, which only a special favoured elite actually enjoy. The evocation of the philosophical genius period serves only to set up the critical wisdom of the learned as at its proper extreme. The enlighteners were all of them opposed to enthusiasm, and on that front Hegel is wholehearted as any of them. We can easily grasp clouds of error instead of the heavens of truth. Therefore we must agree that the empiricist critique of human understanding which Locke begins and Kant brought apparently to a decisive skeptical conclusion as far as absolute knowledge of reason is concerned was entirely right and proper. The locus classicus for the beginning of the attack upon the supposed intuition of absolute being in the interest of philosophy of experience is a passage in the first pages of Locke's essay, which Hegel himself cited in Faith and Knowledge. Quote, "For I thought that the first step towards satisfying several inquiries, the mind of man was very apt to run into was to take a survey of our own understandings, examine our own powers, and see what things they were adapted. Till that was done, I suspected we begin at the wrong end and in vain sought for satisfaction in a quiet and sure possession of truths that most concerned us, whilst we let loose our thoughts into the vast ocean of being, as if all that boundless extent were the natural and undoubted possession of our understandings, wherein there was nothing exempt from its decision, or that escaped its comprehension. Thus men extending their inquiries beyond their capacities and letting their thoughts wander into those depths where they can find no sure footing. It is no wonder that they raise questions and multiply disputes which never coming to any clear resolution are proper only to continue and increase their doubts and to confirm them at least in perfect skepticism. Whereas where the capacities of our understanding well considered, the extent of our knowledge once discovered, and the horizon found which sets the bounds between the enlightened and dark parts of things, between what is and what is not comprehensible by us, men would perhaps with less scruple acquiesce in the avowed ignorance of the one and employ their thoughts and discourse and with more advantage and satisfaction in the other. This program is the conceptual context for Kant's Copernican revolution in philosophy. So let me just see here. There's a footnote. So the footnote, yes, I see, because Harris doesn't go to the back of the book. So 168. And the footnote is number 9. Okay, so let's duplicate this. I'm going to have a look at this footnote because I have a feeling it's interesting. So we need to go to page 197. Ten pages away from here. Okay, here we have it, number 9. Harris's book is truly amazing. So here we have it. So the footnote is, this program is the conceptual context for Kant's Copernican revolution in philosophy. And then number 8 is above that. So this is Essay, Book 1, Chapter 1, Section 7. Hegel quotes this passage from his German translation at the beginning of the Kant section of Faith and Knowledge. And that is from Locke. And then we have the context of Locke being the context for Kant's Copernican revolution. Pippin says that Hegel's idealism is an extension of Kant's project, and I have enthusiastically endorsed this thesis. But the extension involves a radical transformation, which we see in Westphal and H.S. Harris. In the end, the argument about whether Kant is a realist or an idealist is a logomachi. In his own sense, Hegel is both, and in the familiar traditional sense, he is neither. The objective idealist perspective is well stated by Pippin, but the grounds of Hegel's realism emerge as soon as Pippin turns his attention from K. Westphal's criticism to Sally Sedgwick. A more radical reading of Hegel as a critical idealist can be found in Terry Prinkard. The relation between his view and Pippin's can be seen there. See Robert Pippin. For an admirably brief, clear statement of Hegel's realism, see Westphal. Now this is big, and this is the center of the debates over what Hegel is, I mean, and what he's trying to do. So I'm going to take a photo of this. Seem to be doing everything but being able to take a photo. Anyway, this is page 197, and it explains the big debate between Hegel being a realist and being an idealist. So we'll come back to this, page 197. I'm going to put a mark in this. Okay. But it is obvious that the projected critique of our cognitive faculties presuppose that we do already know, or can at once decide if we are challenged, where the boundaries is between what we truly know and what we do not know. And it is equally obvious that the presupposition itself cannot pass, and has never passed unchallenged. Locke's program presupposed that the content of our knowledge was all Vorstellung, derived from experience. But Plato had long ago argued, on the contrary, that our very experience of all such Vorstellung shows that they cannot be the objects of true knowledge. According to him, we do know a priori what real knowledge is, and hence we know that experience itself is not the source of it. Aristotle had already striven to mediate this conflict between naive experience and the critical reaction to this naive assumption, and Locke was naively presupposing the correctness of Aristotle's definition in our situation when he set out to make his survey of it. According to the view that Locke inherited from Aristotle, our sensory experience is what all of our knowledge depends on and is derived from. On this view, the human cognitive faculty is the instrument by which we derive knowledge from experience. According to this view that Descartes inherited from Plato, on the other hand, our cognitive faculty is the transparent medium through which we see what the knowledge of true being is, and we are consequently enabled to settle the rather lowly cognitive status that is to be assigned to sensory experience. Kant inherited both traditions, sought, like Aristotle before him, to mediate between them. Okay, so let's see. Like Aristotle, his object was to raise the cognitive status of our empirical knowledge and to rescue it from the skeptical attack of an ultimately Platonic pure reason. The whole project of the critique of pure reason exists in the context of a higher, purely rational knowledge that we do not have and cannot have, except in the negative sense that we achieve a logical, i.e. rational, intuitive certainty that we cannot have. This is evident in the case of Locke, whose essay begins with a great polemic against the Cambridge Platonists, as it is Kant. Hegel's critique of reason is the first in which this concept of reason is completely absorbed into experience. Much of his overt criticism is directed at the Kantian mediation of the perennial struggle, but his aim is to make the Kantian critique more radical, to make it comprehend the rational context of the older attempt to define its limits of human cognition. Hegel is the first to deserve the title of radical empiricist, and the phenomenology is the first system of radical empiricism. So let's see this here. So we've read 9. So let's go back to see 9. So this Kant inherited both traditions and sought, like Aristotle before him, to mediate between them. Okay, so number 10, the instrument. Max Werner treats both the instrument and the medium view as Kant's. Also thinks that both metaphors are essentially Kantian. So does Solomon. I think this is an inaccurate interpretation of Hegel's serious concern. He begins with Kant because he has the writing of an adequate critique of pure reason in mind, but Kant would not have had the ambivalent Vorstellung of cognition if the alternatives were not themselves older. For the instrumental view, see, and Hegel's ironic comment in the History of Philosophy lectures about going after truth with spears and staves. This comment implicitly identifies Kant with Judas. Compare Matthew, Mark, Luke, compare further encyclopedia. The medium is not passive or transparent one, but one that distorts. That is what is offered by Kant's theory of the forms of intuition, which is based upon Haldane and Simpson. See also a given analysis by Heidegger. Needless to say, he's not an empiricist in the manner of Locke, Berkeley, and Hume. Okay, amazing. Okay, so where are we then? Much of his overt criticism is directed at the Kantian mediation of the perennial struggle, but his aim is to make the Kantian critique more radical, to make it comprehend the rational context of the older attempts to define the limits of human cognition. Hegel is the first to deserve this title of radical empiricist, and the phenomenology is the first of radical empiricism. In order to be radical, we must surrender the fear of error which makes us cling to unexamined criterion of intuitive certainty by which we define the bounds of our knowledge. For experience shows that if we surrender to the fear and cling to our intuitive criterion, we find that the bounds of our certain knowledge shrink to a vanishing point. This was true in the history of Greek speculation. It was validated again in Hume's critique of Locke, and the same skeptical dialectic is visible among the followers of Kant. The fear of grasping clouds of error instead of heavens of truth is a Kantian critical one. The conviction that the whole project of securing the in itself for consciousness through cognition is contradictory in its very concept can be recognized in Kant, and Hegel poked fun at Reinhold's formulation of the incomprehensible Urwahre in the difference essay. This arch-true is unconceivable, yet it is to be discovered and established along with the true, and the true is to be discovered and established through the arch-true. Hegel shows in his criticism of this paradox that upon this view, reason cannot assume an active relation to the absolute. So philosophy means absorbing into oneself the absolute passive receptivity, something that is already fully completed knowledge. This passive receptivity is not what the critical philosophy itself means by cognition, however. Thus, Reinhold's program really brings us to the skeptical mysticism of Jacobi with respect to all finite knowledge that pretends to be scientific. Our sciences are games in which the human spirit organizes only its ignorance. The very fact that all empirical cognition is finite shows that whatever we receive through the medium of the senses is not truth as it is in itself. Fichte sought to obviate this problem about the finitude of all theoretical knowledge by making the world of theoretical cognition a mere stage or practice ground for practical reason. Thus, in our moral activity, we have genuine access to absolute truth, but we have to subtract everything that derives from our own desires and our empirical circumstances. These finite aspects cause a refraction of the ray of the absolute truth, and if we remove them, we are left with the bare forms of moral subjectivity, the ego as a mere direction of activity, and worldly objectivity, the Anstoss obstacle, thing in itself, upon which the ego's activity strikes. Just whose theory is portrayed through the metaphor of catching a bird with a lime twig, I am not sure. The point of the comparison is that we draw the truth towards us. Speculative reason is supposed to bring God nearer to us and enable us to see the truth from close up. Hegel's own procedure in the dialectic of consciousness does show us how the organization of sense experience could be viewed in this way, and he needs to mention the view that cognition is a way of bringing the absolute nearer, precisely because his own procedure certainly looks a bit like that. So he has to point the contrast as sharply as possible. One thing that he shared with Jacobi was a conviction that we are always as close to the absolute as we can ever get. It is already with us, bei uns, or we are at home in it at the very beginning. In Hegel's procedure, our initial sense certainty has to be gathered up, comprehended, and retained as an essential moment, the existential foundation, in fact, of our absolute knowledge. The spirit comes to self-possession in and for a self-certain consciousness which sleeps and wakes in a house with a tree outside it, and which possesses all the natural appurtenances that implies. It exists now and here, and we do not have to be freed from the body, or to clarify any aspect of experience away as the supposed cause of distance in order for it to present to us and in us. The passage about the ruse list, which the Absolute would jeer at, spotten, is the only part of this paragraph in which Hegel himself is being critical. It seems that he is attacking the recrudescence of enthusiasm as genius philosophy after Kant's revolution. The rest of the paragraph is purely descriptive. It offers only a bird's-eye view of the skeptical results of Kant and Fichte as the critical heirs of rationalism and empiricism. As far as absolute knowledge is concerned, so it is misguided to regard a serious criticism of the epistemology of Kant and Fichte. The instrumental view of knowledge belongs to empiricism as a whole, in which the only future furniture of the mind is ideas that represent things, and the medium view belongs to rationalism as a whole. There is no intention to characterize anyone's view precisely in its details, and the object is only to show why skepticism about the cognition of the absolute is the necessary and appropriate stance of the wise. Unless one thinks that Kant's representative doctrine of the unknowable thing in itself, or Fichte's medium conception of the self-positing spontaneity of the ego is seriously misrepresented here, there is no point in attacking this paragraph. Okay, so we have read Pinkert and we've read Harris. So now we have 74. Meanwhile, if the anxiety about falling into error sets up a mistrust of science, which itself is untroubled by those scruples, and simply sets itself to its work and actually gets down to cognizing, then it is difficult to see why there should not be, instead of a mistrust of this mistrust, that is, why there should not be an anxiety over whether the fear of error is not already the error itself. In fact, this fear presupposes that there is something, namely a great deal, which is the truth, and it supports its scruples and its deductions on some other basis, which is itself in need of examination as to whether it is the truth. It presupposes that is representations of cognition as an instrument and as a medium, and it also presupposes a distinction between ourselves and this cognition. However, it above all presupposes that the absolute stands on one side of a divide and cognition on the other, and that cognition exists on its own, that it is separated from the absolute but is still something real. That is, it presupposes that since such a cognition is external to the absolute, it is also indeed external to the truth, but that it is nonetheless itself truthful. The presupposition which calls itself the fear of error thus reveals itself to be more likely the fear of the truth. Okay, let's see what Pinkert has to say on this. 73. We've done 74. So we've done 73, 74. Hegel speaks of people in his time having a mistrust of Wissenschaft. This seems to be a mistrust of all philosophy that speaks of the absolute. But is the assertion of the primacy of the finite itself infinite? That is it a boundless assertion to say that the whole is a set of finite things? Where is the person standing who says, quote, the whole is finite, in order to be able to say that? Is he or she standing outside the world, a little like someone's conception of God? Maybe this is all just wholly abstract, so the suspicion goes with no consequence for anything significant, thus the mistrust. But ought we mistrust the mistrust? Such a procedure shares a certain picture of knowing as representationalist at its core. When we state something, so it seems our statement representation might stop somewhere short of the fact. That supposedly is what happens with false statements. Why should we take that view, however natural it might seem to be? Hegel's view, when we say winter has arrived, if that is true, winter has arrived. Pardon. The thought and the state of affairs are one. That is not the same thing as saying that the thing is identical to a psychological state of mind. It's that the thought, winter has arrived, is that winter has arrived, and winter has arrived. We should not only ask how do we truly judge of things, but also how are things truly judged. Okay. 74. Why should we not mistrust this mistrust, since the assumptions make cognition self-contradictory? The assumption of the empty self as instrument or medium on one side and the absolute to connect with on the other side is wrong. The ideal of knowledge as comprehension overcomes the mistake involved in conceiving cognition as either an instrument or as a medium. Both views take for granted the very thing that ought to be regarded as problematic, and the fact that the answers can be and are taken for granted in quite opposite ways is what shows how problematic they are. Once we assume that the truth is somewhere outside or above us, the criterion by which we know will always suffice to guarantee that the relation of externality or inferiority is maintained. It is the criterion itself by which we certainly know this that needs to be examined. We must first turn our critical eye upon the mistrust that led to the critical reaction in the first place. This applies both to the reaction of Plato and Descartes and that of Locke and Kant. But it is the Kantian reaction that is now present. So let's have a look here now at 17. Okay, I'm just going to have a little look back at, so we're at 17 here. And we have 15 in the previous one. So this Bayons, we are already at home in it. So just forgive me for going back a little bit. Okay. So we also have 14 to look at here, which might be interesting too. So 14. Thus, Reinhold's program really brings us the skeptical mysticism of Jacobi with respect to all finite knowledge that pretends to be scientific. Quote, our sciences are games in which the human spirit organizes only its ignorance. So that's 14. Hegel's footnote shows how we can pass directly from the critique of Reinhold in difference to that of Jacobian faith in knowledge. Jacobi's mysticism rests on the absurdity of the medium concept of finite truth. Fichte's idealism purports to provide a practical access to the absolute for which the scientific games of finite intellect supply an exercise ground. Now, what is 15 about? So that's what we have here. 15. It is already with us, the absolute, okay? This is one of the great cruxes of the phenomenology, but even if we take Hegel's assertion as literally as Heidegger did, we can only understand the explanations they offer by accepting the book as a ladder to absolute knowing. For our plain common sense, we must begin with the problem of what do these speculative thinkers mean? Even if we find, when we come back to the beginning after making the circle, that absolute was Bayons from the first. So let's look at 16. Okay. There is no intention to characterize anyone's view precisely in details. The object is only to show why skepticism about the cognition of the absolute is the necessary and appropriate stance of the wise. Unless one thinks that Kant's representative doctrine of the unknowable thing in itself, or Fichte's medium conception of the self-positing spontaneity of the ego, is seriously misrepresented here, there is no point in attacking this paragraph. So 16. Habermas was wrong, for example, to complain that Hegel's critique is not imminent here. But in his next text paragraph, he takes up Hegel's point in the right way. So now we can go to 17, which is where we were, and which is the difference between Plato, Descartes, Locke, and Kant, and the Kantian one here. In Hegel's earlier critical writings, it is principally Reinhold whose fear of error is stigmatized as fear of the truth. But the next paragraph shows that it is the empiricist determination to do without absolute knowledge that is Hegel's real intellectual quarry. We can see here that Pippin is right in arguing that Hegel wants to provoke a Kantian deduction of knowledge and to resolve the problem of transcendental skepticism. This response to the objection of E. Tugendhat are perfectly correct as far as his thesis goes, which is to the end of the first volume of his commentary. In chapter B, the characterization of the phenomenology as a critical introduction becomes insufficient. We shall have to recognize it as a positive science on its own account and as part of the science of the system. Okay. In paragraph 74, Hegel is defending the view of all orthodox religious members of the community that we live and move and have our being in God. According to this religious conviction of the many, the mistake of critical reason, which gives rise to skepticism, is the initial assumptions that any object of cognition, including the absolute, must be an object of consciousness, like a tree for the empiricists, or the theorem of Pythagoras for the rationalists. The great range of views that Hegel sums up telegraphically under the heading instrument and medium all assume that the structure of consciousness, a knowing subject reflecting upon an object externally, is the structure of cognition. Only Fichte, with his theory of reflection itself as a self-posited act, is on the verge of a different view. By bending the pure direction of Fichte's active ego back upon itself, we can obtain a place that is no longer blank or empty. And the view that the wise will come to a true coincidence with the religious intuition of the many. What justifies us in standing by the religious optimism of the pre-philosophical consciousness is the fact that even the rational skeptics hold that their critical reason does give us knowledge. But what makes it necessary to see if this negative knowledge can be turned over is the rebirth of a supra-rational enthusiasm that despises critical understanding. Okay, let's go to 75. 75. This conclusion is drawn from the following. The absolute alone is true, that is, it is the true which is alone, the absolute. One can reject this conclusion if one distinguishes between a cognition which does not cognize the absolute as science wants to do, but which is nonetheless true, and cognition itself, which, although it may be incapable of grasping the absolute, may still be capable of grasping some other truths. However, we gradually come to see that this kind of back and forth blather merely leads to a very kind of murky distinction between an absolute truth and a truth of some other kind. It also leads us to the conclusion that the absolute, cognition, etc. are words which presuppose a meaning, and it is going to require far more work if we are to get what those meanings are. The absolute alone is true, and only the true is absolute. Yet Hegel quite clearly thinks that something about this is wrong-headed. He says that, in fact, this just shows how little we understand what we are saying when we use these words. At this level of abstraction, we can easily be misled into thinking we have rock-solid arguments for one side or the other, or that we think we are making sense when we are actually making little to no sense at all. Maybe we can know, in some sense of know, lots of things without knowing about the absolute. But Is there a kind of internal push or teleology in reason itself which wishes to extend its knowledge to the unconditioned? Kant, for example, says that reason is pushed by itself to be unconditioned. Part of the task Hegel sets for himself is to show that we are indeed so pushed that it's the failure of our trying to do something else that necessitates our taking a more speculative stance. It's not that we start out asking what is the absolute, and we at first fail to do so. It's that we start out asking something else, such as, what do I know with certainty? And it is in failing to make good on that question and failing to make good on what succeeds is that we realize that what we had been doing all along, although we could not have stated it that way at first, was looking for the absolute. What we were doing in itself, an sich, had not yet developed enough so that it could be posited. Note too how he says that although we must also think, we already fully understand words like cognition, absolute, and so forth. It's not clear that we do. He's hinting at his more developed view, that with regard to these basic concepts, we do not necessarily understand the full meaning just because we can master the public criteria for their use. Their meaning develops over time and over the course of inquiry. 75. Only the absolute is true and vice versa. All talk of non-absolute truth in cognition remains obscure until the meaning of absolute truth and cognition is established. So I'm just going to check here. Okay. It is possible to read Kant's Critique of Pure Reason as a defense of the validity of finite knowledge in the absence of any absolute knowledge. Kant himself, with his regulative principles and his postulates of practical reason, certainly did not pretend that we can maintain our scientific and civilized life without making some absolute presuppositions. But many empiricists have believed that science can go ahead without troubling about the problem of justifying its assumptions. Hegel implicitly concedes that this is possible. Philosophy becomes a need only when some serious tension in the regulative ideals of science and society has emerged. But when that happens, something better than a shifting back and forth in our speech, a shifting between phenomenal and noumenal realms, for example, is required. So let's see, 18. For a good account of Hegel's mature theory of truth, see Macumber, many forms of sub-philosophical consciousness maintain themselves by hin und herren. This is typical of perception and its analogues. But in philosophical self-consciousness, it becomes too blatantly obvious to be effective. Several stages of gradual recognition that a new integration of our conscious world is needed to illustrate in the phenomenology. Okay, let's go back to the text. So that was footnote 18. The unity of cultural consciousness must be re-established now from its conceptual foundations. The recognition that this is the task of philosophy, that it can no longer be achieved by a faith of any kind, is a climax of the evolution of scientific self-consciousness. Because of the vacuum created by the skeptical conclusion that Kant gave to the rationalist tradition in fulfillment of Locke's philosophy of experience, various forms of religious philosophy have emerged. Kant's own religion within the bounds of reason carried on the tradition that began in Locke, if not earlier. But even while Hegel was writing this introduction, Fichte's way to the blessed life proclaimed his adherence to the romantic religion of immediate feeling. This return to immediate rationality and divinity was the real enemy against which humane understanding now has to defend itself. Kant was proud of having made room for faith, but we can see from the preface that in Hegel's view, that boast was Kant's greatest mistake. we must test whether the religious assumption can be validated by reason itself instead of simply assuming that philosophy cannot transcend the standpoint of consciousness. Otherwise, the unclear Truba distinction between what is absolutely true and what is true in some other way will give us no peace. Let us read now 76. Instead of worrying ourselves over such useless ways of talking and thinking about cognition, such as those that hold cognition either to be an instrument to take hold of the absolute or as a medium through which we catch a glimpse of the truth and so on, which is the direction taken by all these conceptions of cognition as separated from the absolute and of the absolute as separated from cognition. And if instead of worrying about those kinds of excuses which, by presupposing such relations, create the incapacity of science, and at the same time also both free us from the hard work of science and enable us to put on the air of serious and fervent effort, that is, if instead of getting down to the work of actually answering these questions, we could just basically rid ourselves of all those conceptions, declare them to be contingent and arbitrary, and regard them as trick words, such as absolute cognition, as well as objective and subjective, as well as innumerable other words whose meaning are generally assumed to be well known. The pretense that their meaning is in part generally well known, and that in part one is even in possession of their concept, is something which itself seems to arise merely in order to spare us the most important thing, which is just to provide this concept. By way of contrast, we might, with even more justification, simply spare ourselves the trouble of taking any notice at all of those ways of talking and thinking which are themselves supposed to keep science at bay, for they merely constitute a barren appearance of knowledge, which itself immediately vanishes once science itself becomes on the scene. However, in coming on the scene, science is itself an appearance, and as it comes on the scene, science has not yet itself been worked out in its truth in an extensive way. It makes no difference in this regard whether we think of science as an appearance because it comes on the scene alongside other ways of knowing, or whether we call that other untrue knowledge its appearance. But science must free itself from this semblance, and it can only do so by turning against it. This is so because science cannot disregard a non-truthful cognition on the grounds that it is merely a common view of things, while at the same time assuring us both that it is itself an entirely different kind of knowledge, and that the other kind of knowledge amounts to nothing at all for it. Nor can it appeal to some vague intimation about there being something even better in the common view. By way of that assurance, it declares its power to lie in its being. However, untrue knowledge equally appeals to the same thing, namely that it exists, and it assures us that in its eyes science amounts to nothing. However, one merely jejune assurance accounts for just as much another. Still less can science appeal to the better intimations, which are supposed to be the present and non-truthful cognition, and which supposedly point towards science. If it did so, then on the one hand, it would be appealing once again either to what merely is, or to itself, both in the mode in which it exists in non-truthful cognition, which is to say, to a bad mode of its being, and thus to its appearance rather than to the way it exists in and for itself. It is for this reason that the exposition of the phenomenal knowledge is supposed to be undertaken here. Okay, so we'll read up to 77 today. What is Wissenschaft? Note that in Hegel's day, Wissenschaft wasn't quite what we now call science. Theology, for example, was aspiring to be a Wissenschaft. The alternatives to Wissenschaft might seem only to be mere appearances, but Wissenschaft itself is also an appearance. It's one of those things that cropped up in European culture, along with the divine right of kings, Romanticism, opera, Santana, form, etc. These other modes that make the claim to knowledge are themselves appearances, finite, limited, maybe not really attuned to the better argument. But the same charge can be made against Wissenschaft itself. All of them seem to assume that one must arbitrarily start from somewhere. Hegel's point might be put in our terms as the claim that Wissenschaft is only itself a cultural form alongside lots of others. In those cases, we have one form merely giving us an assurance that is not science and is the truth. Hegel will argue that Wissenschaft is indeed an appearance in that sense, and that does not vitiate it once it is fairly well understood. Still, science has to vindicate itself beyond these others without just begging the question. Is there untrue knowledge? Is there something else that is not cognition, that actually gives us a better apprehension of the absolute? Religion, art, mystical feeling. Is there an identity of something, the absolute, which has various guises under which it appears, mystical feeling, religion, philosophy? How does Wissenschaft establish itself without begging the question? In the logic, Hegel calls the pure concepts of metaphysics a Schachtreich, a realm of shadows. What's casting the shadows? What's the light source? One possible answer, the absolute. It can't be that non-philosophy points to philosophy, which would be the case if it is philosophy as a discipline that exclusively investigates the presuppositions of everything else, the concept at work in Fichte's Wissenschaftslehre. It's not that philosophy is the presupposition of all normal activity, but that certain forms of normal activity cannot achieve the ends to which they are pushed to entertain without bringing in philosophy. Besides, that would beg the question as to whether we are then just presupposing the truth of the experience whose presuppositions we are looking for. Thus, we must have an exhibition showing a Darstellung which has these three meanings of phenomenal knowledge, erscheinende Wissen, appearing knowledge. But in doing so, as Richard Rorty used to say, are we then really only celebrating our own achievements and seeing the past as really just an earlier or failed version of ourselves? So let's look at 76. I really like Harris, by the way. And then we'll go and read 77. We could simply reject and ignore all this. We could simply reject and ignore all this critically skeptical talk that takes its own clarity for granted, and we could ignore the mystical anti-scientific talk with an even better right. But this would make our absolute science itself unscientific. Absolute science itself appears. Hence, the ordinary position which it called appearance can, with equal right, call it nonsense. So we must display how scientific knowledge appears. For the first readers, the students in Hegel's class, this paragraph was probably rather opaque until he gave more details in his lectures. But our comments can be brief because Hegel has already developed the argument of this paragraph in the preface. We can point to such post-Kantians such as Reinhold and Schulz as examples of those who make the babble of the tradition into the occasion for serious, zealous toil, which avoids the toil of science itself. So let's look at 19. Reinhold's toiling and its relation to the tradition. So this is the different section. Schulz is even more obliviously guilty of deriving the incapacity of science from the presupposition that truth is outside. Okay, so very good. But if we simply expound our new systematic and hence scientific concept of truth, then all existing unscientific concepts can stoutly maintain that they have as good a right to exist as it does. Both Fichte and Schelling had tried to dismiss ordinary unphilosophical common sense and its truth as something quite different from philosophical cognition and not relevant to it. At that stage, Hegel himself, with Schelling's approval, distinguished between the unphilosophy that must simply be subdued in a life and death struggle for recognition, and the imperfect forms of speculative philosophy which can be integrated into self-recognition of the absolute idea. He returns to this same theme here. A struggle for recognition is necessary to establish which is the reality of knowledge and which is the appearance. Science itself is the appearing of the truth of the world, so that in an important sense we can say that sub-philosophical experience is the reality that appears in it. If science claims, on the contrary, to be the noumenal reality that appears in all phenomenal experience and consciousness, it must appear to do so without warrant, since both it and the ordinary knowledge, of which it claims to be the ground, are equally simple phenomena, data, as far as their immediate being is concerned. The way of dealing with the many skeptical epigonies of Kant that is suggested here was the one that Schelling and Hegel had fairly followed in the Critical Journal. Quote, creating the incapacity of science out of the presupposing of these relationships of finite external consciousness was, quote, rejected out of hand as accidental and arbitrary, just as Hegel says it should be. But within a year or two, while Hegel himself was trying to build a critical logic that would provide answers to all this systematically, a group of religious philosophers had emerged right inside the camp of the new idealism, who were opposed to science itself and who wanted to ward it off. Hegel suggests that the ideas and ways of talking adopted by this group could be ignored with even better right. You can already feel that Hegel would be really annoyed by these people. This is 21. Miller's translation assumes that Hegel is talking about the same set of epistemologists all through paragraph 76. But Hegel distinguishes between those who do formal philosophical science and those who use the arguments of formal idealism against science. These two groups are at least roughly identical to the party of the understanding and the party of immediate, rational, and divinity. In the preface, see paragraph 14, Jacobi and Schleiermacher belong to this second party, for Hegel's first reaction to Schleiermacher addressed see difference. So yeah, Jacobi and... if I ever see Hegel, you never know. He's obviously, I'm not going to meet him in this world, but if I ever see him, we'll have a good conversation about Jacobi and Schleiermacher. I think you get a good laugh out of that. Okay. This is very, very good. You know that you're deep into philosophy when you're actually laughing about this stuff. So 21 we just read. Now, but this was just the faith that Kant has made room for. That is why, as the preface has shown, what could at first be greeted with qualified enthusiasm in Schleiermacher's address and then rejected as accidental and arbitrary in the long critical attack on Jacobi, faith and knowledge, must now be answered scientifically. All views maintained by rational thinkers have the same right to exist and be respected as opinions. So the scientific answer must be one that visibly removes science proper from the sphere and level of mere opinion. Opinions like those of Erstemeyer and Gorez make it vividly evident that science coming on the scene is not yet science followed through and spread out in its truth. Any attempt to justify supposedly noumenal truth by appeal to an intimation of it that can be identified in phenomenal experience. Fichte's vocation of man is a clear paradigm of this procedure, is obviously invalid in the way that Hegel points out. But the very attempt testifies implicitly to the fact that there is something logically wrong with just leaving them aside. The phenomenology does proper justice to the actual reciprocity of science and experience. Each of them is shown to be both the appearance and reality of the other. Okay. So I'm going to go soon, but I think we have time for one more. The Bildung of consciousness. So we have just done B, which is the dialectic of doubt. And now we're going on to the Bildung of consciousness, which is 77. Now, let's go back to the very book, 77. Now, because this account is merely phenomenal knowledge for its object, it does not seem itself to be the science that is free and self-moving within its own distinctive shapes. But when it is viewed from this standpoint, it can be taken to be the path of natural consciousness, which presses forward towards true knowledge, or it can be taken to be the path of the soul as it wanders through the series of the ways it takes shape, as if those shapes were stations laid out for it by its own nature, so that it both might purify itself into spirit and through a complete experience of itself achieve a cognitive acquaintance of what it is in itself. Now, 77. It seems that as the Darstellung exposition of Erscheinende Wissen of knowledge as it appears simply can't be the free self-moving Wissenschaft in its own shape, its own Gestalt. After all, in Erscheinung, appearance, Erscheinung, things get moved around by other things, not completely by themselves, and it would then have to take the Erscheinung for granted, or presuppose it, which would undermine its claims to be a self-moving science, or the Darstellung of the path of natural consciousness on its way to Wissenschaft. What does natural mean here? One obvious sense is lack of artifice, a sense of its being the real way to exist. And when we speak of leading a less artificial, more natural life, more likely, though, it refers to the life of a self-conscious organism and the way such self-conscious organism must conduct themselves. They cannot fully be aware of the whole context in which they are acting. They are acting in light of a background attunement that is more or less invisible to them. The question is whether we are just assuming that this path has a natural foreordained end, or we are merely, as it were, listing its stops along the way. Where do reasons run out? Wittgenstein, quote, I have reached the bedrock, and my spade is turned. Then I am inclined to say, this is simply what I do. And what people accept as justification show how they think and live. A shape of self-conscious life spirit has its Darstellung exposition in looking at the justifications people take to be unavoidable within it. A shape shows itself to what people do, namely given justifications among other things they do. Now let's look at 77 in Harris. C. The Bildung of consciousness. This display does not look like a free self-development of science, but it can be taken as the way by which natural consciousness forces itself to knowledge, or the way of the cross by which the natural soul purifies itself into spirit and comes through complete experience of itself to awareness of what it is in itself. This paragraph may seem to suggest that the phenomenology is not a philosophical science at all, but only the way of approaching it. Actually, paragraph 81 tells us the topic that begins here is the mode and necessity of the progression from ordinary phenomenal knowledge to denoumenal science that has just made its own appearance. Hegel regarded this book as the first part of logical science, so he has to explain the relation between the science of experience and the free self-movement of the concept in the science of logic. The movement of the concept of experience is tied down to the historical record of the Weltgeist has actually made. The phenomenology is the scientific comprehension of time, as opposed to the exposition of the eternal standpoint of pure thinking in the science of logic. That is an amazing thing. Time. Just going to write this down. So 196, and then page 173. Our human logic articulates the eternal standpoint of pure thinking in time. So the approach to it must show how the eternal standpoint is in time by comprehending this time, the very time in which the concept of the Weltgeist has been born. This time contains, and hence it can comprehend, the whole genesis of the Weltgeist, which has occupied about 2,000 years, 2,500 years. The appearing of the absolute as the true, or the true as the absolute, among the other theoretical views, is a signal that the true comprehension of what is as spirit is now possible. The display of knowledge appearing does not seem to be the free science moving in its own particular shape. As says Hegel, he has gone over this ground in more detail for us in the preface, spelling out how the phenomenology is both the introduction to logical science and the first part of it. Here he gives a very precise definition both of the conceptual scope of the first part and of the phenomenal territory over which it moves. It is the way of the natural consciousness to true knowledge, or the way of the soul journeying through the sequence of the configurations as stations posited for it in advance by its nature in order that it may purify itself in the spirit. So let's have a look at this. 21. Well, 22. Let's have a look at 22. So we have 21. We're at 23, so the purification. We just need to find 22. Yes, so each of them show the appearance of the reality of the other. So what is that? Westphalt asks rhetorically, quote, why not just do science and forget epistemology? But he has already noted that, quote, Hegel has challenged the presumption that transcendental knowledge, second-order knowledge about what empirical knowledge is any less problematic or available than empirical knowledge. His way of putting the problem is the correct one, and without the phenomenology there is no answer. Many self-styled Hegelians have taken this route of simply ignoring the problem, as Westphalt says. Hegel raises this very same objection against Jacobi. There has been a debate among German commentators that can be summarized as follows. Fulda. Every other appearance of truth says that science is an appearance, becomes other truths. But they are mistaken, and that must be shown. Put Puntal. But when science appears, it is only an appearance, and it only becomes science by giving all the others appearances their place in moments. Dietrich Heinrich adds the point that science liberates itself from the appearance by establishing its intersubjective character as conceptual communication. I agree with the whole sequence, but Fulda concentrates too narrowly on the introduction sublation of the apparent character of science. Okay. So what is the role of appearance in science and epistemology? So that's that one. So '23. So I just read 22 there, and then 23. Okay, so let's read this. The display of knowledge appearing does not seem to be the free movement of science in its own particular shape, says Hegel. He's gone over this ground in more detail for us in the preface, spelling out how in the phenomenology is both the introduction to the logical science and the first part of it. Here he gives us a very precise definition both of the conceptual scope of the first part and the phenomenal territory over which it moves. It is the way the natural consciousness to true knowledge, or the way of the soul journeying through the sequence of its configurations as stations posited for it in advance of the nature in order that it may purify itself in the spirit. So let's look at 23. Westphalt comments that this passage and the related ones in paragraph 78 and 79 have created an erroneous supposition that there is one single cumulative developmental plotted in the phenomenology. Interesting. He thinks that there are developmental sequences only within each major section. It is true that the comprehension of time is complex, and since we have to start from our experience now, it cannot be simply linear in time, but there is a single cumulative development of our experience. And when we come to the point where we can comprehend the development of world spirit, we do see how our cumulative comprehension has already been experienced as a linear progression. in time by the universal consciousness of the culture that is ours. See further the next note. Westphalt is only repeating what many careful students since Heim have concluded. I have taken him to task here, not because he particularly deserves criticism, but rather for the opposite reason. His analysis has made it possible to get the question into the right perspective. He is well aware that there is a single complex argument in the book, and we shall ourselves see in due course that the sequential connection of chapters 5 can only be comprehended when it is completed as a major section. Okay. The natural consciousness is primitively the human soul in its Aristotelian sense. Aphorism 4, or footnote 4. This agrees with M.A. Gillespie, but as we shall see at once, the most fundamental and continuous meaning of natural consciousness is the ordinary realistic consciousness of educated common sense. It can be identified with the standpoint of consciousness as we find it in the empirical tradition, from Locke to Kant, but the tradition is too much infected by the skeptical difficulties that are the despair of natural consciousness to count as natural consciousness proper. There is a good review of the problem of natural consciousness in A. Gazer. In his discussion of the way of the soul, he sticks mainly to Platonic and Neoplatonic models, but admits to medieval ones too. The human soul lies in the form of a natural organism, which is capable of reason, but this nature lies far behind us in our ordinary consciousness of everyday life. We shall begin with our ordinary consciousness and find our way back to that natural self when it becomes necessary. Before that, we shall have seen how every shape of consciousness takes itself to be in possession of the truth of human nature. In this sense, every post on our journey is a natural consciousness. The natural consciousness, Hegel tells us, in paragraph 78, will prove itself to be the only concept of knowing, not real knowing. Here he is referring directly to the plain common sense with which the journey of the soul begins. Every subsequent position of consciousness necessarily contains sublated within it the sense certainty of a self that lives and moves along its own things, Sachen, upon turning earth. Even the primitively natural self is aware of this. The primitively natural consciousness does not know, for instance, that its earth is turning. That is a discovery of the understanding. But the sun comes and goes to light the world and natural self's house and home. So that is where the appearing of knowing begins. What has to be shown is how this appearing of the natural consciousness, which remains constantly present in all other shapes, however much the interpretation of its truth value may change, is identical with the scientific knowledge that has made its appearance quite recently. Hegel's science of appearing knowledge aims to show that what seems to have appeared only yesterday has actually been appearing progressively ever since the primitively natural self first asserted itself. The shape of absolute knowing, its first appearance, is still with us, and we, the shape of the scientific knowing that presents faces that first appearance as a seeming opponent. In paragraph 78, we had two forms of appearing knowledge: the true, or noumenal, knowing of philosophical science, and the untrue, or empirical, phenomenal, knowing, or ordinary consciousness. Now and from henceforth, we only have Erscheinende Wissen. So what does 25 say? There are places where it is clearly correct to take Erscheinende Wissen as phenomenal knowledge. Miller does it too often. But where it is opposed to Wissenschaft, as here at the beginning of paragraph 77, this locution is the best. Equally, there are places where it means apparent knowledge as opposed to true knowledge. As Lowenberg argues, a good instance is the paragraph 76, quote, "They constitute only an empty appearance of knowing which vanishes immediately in the face of science, making its entrance," end quote. But the predominant sense, as when we read that Darstellung des Erscheinende Wissen will here be untaken, is knowing in the process of appearing. What we are concerned with is the sound common sense that is on its way to self-recognition. in science, compare W. Marx and Lowenberg, it is a mistake to think that the falsity of ordinary consciousness is more important than its truth. The way of the cross is also the way of salvation, and our Hegelian salvation is not in another world of pure science. So the appearing of knowing is the progressive discovery of the absolute perspective in which all shapes of experience can reveal their truth. See especially Hegel's letter to Duboc, 30th of July, 1822. I hold that this content, the true, is present in every sound consciousness in all religious and philosophies, but that our standpoint of today to be cognized of it, fully developed, and this cannot happen in any but the scientific way, which is thus at the same time a unique pattern, art, in which it can be proved. Thus, the view of Habermas, that the epistemological ladder can be thrown away at once it has been climbed, is quite mistaken. Very good. So where are we now? Okay, so we just looked at 25. So let's look at 25. The natural consciousness will go on a pilgrimage. We are to observe the human consciousness that drives forward towards the goal of its nature, which has to truly know, or know truly. In this drive, consciousness does not cease to be natural. It will have only one truth at a time as its nature, but we shall preserve for it the whole history of the Durchwanderung, and we shall show it in the end how every one of the stations appointed for its own by its nature is necessary to it, just as every phase of growth is necessary to the plant. In particular, we shall show that the first station, which the pilgrim knowledge can never really forget, as it does forget other stations, and which is there at the end like an acorn hanging on a mature oak, is not opposed to the last station at all. On the contrary, just as the acorn for the sake of the oak as the beginning, so the oak is for the sake of the acorn at the end. The whole cycle will then be seen to be for the sake of free science in its own particular shape. But it will also be the science of appearing knowledge in its own right. It should be noticed that we, the scientific observers, are already in possession of the science that has just now appeared, and it is Schelling's science that we have, even though Fichte is the inspiration of our absolutely reflective self-observation. Without Schelling's philosophy of nature, we could not stand in for concept and make the transition from the infinite of understanding to the living rational organism. But our clear understanding of just when knowing first became self-consciously absolute is no less important. This is why Hegel put spirit into the title of the book. The appearing of absolute knowing, which has reached its self-conscious shape in the identity philosophy, began as a religious experience with Jesus. The Spirit appeared, a sense-certain experience at Pentecost, and it was for the sake of appearance that Jesus died. Hence, our journey from common sense to science can be regarded as the world spirit way of the cross. The science of experience explicates the universal meaning of passion story. Reason will reenact for us the drama of confusion, of the crucifixion, resurrection, ascension into heaven, and finally manifestation of spirit. So there is a lot in that. An amazing session of reading from the first 5 sections of Hegel's introduction. So we've gone from 78. We started, yeah. So yeah, there isn't actually that much in the introduction. I mean, we can get that introduction done. So it is from 73 to 89. That's brilliant. That is very good. So we'll get that done over the next month or two. Okay. Take care, guys. See you next time.